Hello and welcome to the Invest in Africa Virtual Summit. I am Anna, your host today, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Alexander Boadi. Alexander Boadi is the founder and director of Let's Move Africa, as well as the Let's Move Africa Foundation. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So what I'm going to do is just going to tell the audience a little bit more about your company. So LMA is a London-based real estate brokerage, consultancy, and research firm that focus on the African markets. LMA, which is Let's Move Africa, specialize in obtaining finance for real estate asset holders and consultants on public-private partnership. They also produce research reports for companies that wish to know more about the African real estate market, and they also consult with African governments about investments and trade issues. LMA also assists investors in Africa to access the UK real estate market. So you got quite a lot of hats going on there. So what do you think? What do you think about Africa as an attractive place to invest?
Hmm.
Let's start with that.
Okay, I mean, in regards to Africa being a fantastic place to invest, it certainly is. Africa is probably the last frontier, and Africa is the only place, well, the best place in the world for continuous sun. So, in regards to investment, you can't really go wrong in that aspect. But from a capital point of view, Africa has phenomenal rates of returns in regards to investment. So, if you're looking at real estate investment, which we tend to focus on, there's a lot of opportunities in the retail sector due to the middle class in Africa and the high populational demographic of under 25s. They're very much into the whole Western culture of malls. So there's fantastic opportunities there. You've got great opportunities in residential real estate. So a young couple wants to move out of their parents' home. You know, there's opportunities for them, for someone to develop that particular house for them. There's opportunities in the industrial sector, factories. There's opportunities in the leisure sector if you want to build a hotel. Because as I mentioned previously, because of the sun and the
Yeah.
beaches, you have an abundance of tourists. So there's opportunities in many sectors surrounding real estate. And as I mentioned, the yields are high, and the legislations and policies governments are putting in place nowadays are making business easier. So it's certainly a fantastic place to invest.
Well, you brought up the point about working with the government or the government's involvement. So can you tell us how important is it to establish the partnership with the government?
Yeah, sure. There used to be a time where people would invest with private individuals, and what would happen is they'll tend to encounter issues surrounding title to land
Hmm.
or missing funds. But now, what people are tending to do is work in collaboration with the government. When you work in collaboration with the government, we're not sort of saying, look, all your problems will be eased. We are simply saying it's a safer option and probably the best option in returns to security of your funds. With the government, they have access to government-owned and lands. They have access to the best lawyers. All governments are working in collaboration with international banks. So there are certain procedures and laws that they have to
Yeah.
follow. So if they are to break these particular laws or policies or legislations, then the international backers will, shall we say, pull the plug on funding. So
Yes.
therefore, the government needs to make sure that they are following best practices. That's why I always tell my investors or people who are interested in investing to make sure or try to make sure your collaboration is government backed.
Okay. And when we talk about property prices, because you mentioned that as well, there seems to be a noticeable increase in Kenya. It's actually at exorbitant margins. Do you think that there probably might produce some kind of bubble in the market?
Potentially may produce a bubble, but you have to look at what income bracket we're talking about. So you've got the low income housing, which is classified as affordable housing. There won't be a bubble for that simply because the demand outweighs the supply.
Okay.
In terms of the middle income earners, there may potentially be a bubble in Kenya because the demand and the supply are much closer to each other. But when you
Hmm.
look at the high income sector, the high income market, that's the sector which there could potentially be some issues, because you have expatriates, you have people that work for diplomatic embassies, you have the corporate world coming into Kenya, but there's not enough high end to service them. So that can inflate prices on the residential high end. Also, you've got the tech world. Kenya, or Nairobi, is known as the Silicon Valley of
Yes.
Africa. So because of that, you have an influx of companies from the West who are trying to penetrate the market, and they're accustomed to a particular style of living. So that particular market, the high-end luxury market, is where they tend to be. So in terms of the bubble, based upon that, on the high end, there could be a bubble, but this is why we're encouraging and urging people to invest in Africa, to suppress the requirements for housing. And I think the most important thing is that there are opportunities, and there are individuals that are interested. So your yields and your returns will always be there.
Well, Kenya is part of the highest demand, but there's also other sub-Sahara African countries that are also in demand. So, do you think that there will be a short supply for middle income properties when you're looking at Ghana, Tanzania, Kenya, Nigeria, for example?
I I mean, there is a short supply now. There is definitely not enough supply to match the demand on the middle income earners. And when we
Okay.
talk about middle income earners, we're talking about civil servants. We're talking about people who are coming from the West, shall we say, into Africa just to kind of have sort of your usual corporate jobs. There's not enough housing to service them. So in terms of your question, there's opportunities there. Again, the needs will always be there. The population in Africa is booming at a rate which has never been seen before. As mentioned previously, it is a young generation, and the young generation have access to information globally, so they
Yes.
understand the types of properties, constructions that are being taken place all around the world, and they're looking for the same standards of living in their particular nation, whether it be Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania. All the youth and the demographics have the same mentality, and they just want adequate housing.
Okay. So let's go back to the foreigners, the ones, the graduates that are coming. So what would be the best way for them to get into a sub-Saharan real estate market?
The best way, as I mentioned previously, is working in collaboration with the government. But I'll come to that in a second. I think what
Okay.
they need to do initially is actually go to the ground, go to whatever country you find of interest, Sierra Leone, Gambia, Congo, Zambia, for example. There's a plethora of choices. Go to those countries. Go on holiday. Don't specifically say I'm going to conduct business. Have an
Okay.
understanding of the cultural norms, because
Hmm.
Africa is very diverse, and even countries itself, within those countries, cities are diverse.
Yes.
Tribalism. So you need to have an understanding of the complexities of the people. Once you've done that and you've got a general feel for the country, then I would suggest go to your local embassy in whatever country you're actually positioned. Have a chat with their trade and investment minister. If you want, you can have a chat with Let's Move Africa, just to have an understanding of what's going on. But I would definitely tell you, go to the country, have a look what's going on, go to the High Commission, talk to the trade and investment, do your due diligence online, talk to consultants that specialize in the African market, and that's your best way to penetrate the market.
Okay. So I want to go back to your organization because,
So,
yeah, that's the reason why we're here, to find out a little bit more. I imagine that you're actually working on some new projects or working on some other project or projects that are actually quite personal to you. Do you mind sharing that with us?
yes, we are working on a few projects. I think there's a very exciting project that we've got going on, which I'm going to hold off from talking about at this moment in time. But
Okay.
negotiations have gone well, and in a few months, things should be clearer. But in regards to what we're specifically focused on, we have collaborations with governments in Africa, which enable us to directly source investment private investment from anywhere, not necessarily the West, but Africa. And the investment will enable the stakeholders to have a piece of real estate land and
Ooh,
develop particular structures whichever in whatever sector may be of interest. As I said, you've got residential, you've got leisure, you've got industrial, you've got commercial. So we do have direct access to governments, and the governments are basically telling us, look, find the investors, let's work together, let's do the consultancy. So that's what we've got going on. We've also got collaboration projects in which there's a lot of vacancy, or there's vacancy rates in commercial buildings in Africa. So we're finding tenants, should it be banks, whether it be,
mm.
I mean, there's so many institutions,
Shopping malls, I imagine.
malls. So maybe, I'm in UK at the moment, so maybe Tesco's want to come to Africa, so they'll go
Okay.
through us. So this is the exciting projects that we've got going on at the moment, and I'll always urge people: look, don't be afraid of Africa. Get involved. It's a fantastic place to invest. Don't be worried. Don't be scared. Yes, there are horror stories, but there's horror stories everywhere.
Everywhere. Yes,
Look,
definitely.
let's look at the positives as opposed to the negatives, and the
Yes,
positives far outweigh the negatives.
I totally agree. And you actually have something even a bit more personal. You have the foundation, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, sure. I do believe in life you always have to give back. So even if you're earning hundreds of billions, there's no point in having hundreds of billions and just, well, buying super yachts. And that's just my opinion. So based upon that, I've decided to set up a foundation. It's called the Let's Move Africa Foundation. And basically what it does, it works in collaboration with sporting agencies in African countries, whether it's the Football Association or the Athletics Association. And we try to give back in terms of books, in terms of sporting equipment, in terms of trainers to the youth. Because if you've been to Africa, you will know that, yes, there is high-end real estate, there's luxury malls, but there is also issues surrounding poverty,
Hmm.
issues surrounding youth mutilation. There's issues surrounding sanitation issues. So I mean, HIV/AIDS. I can list the amount of issues there are, and we can't just focus on the capital and the dollars and the euros and the pounds. We also have to focus on the human element and the human aspect. So that is what Let's Move Africa does in terms of the foundation. And if you would like to find out more about that, it's info@letsmoveafrica.com. And yeah, we're always willing to get involved with any projects that assist youth or the disenfranchised in any particular nation.
That's a great project and a great motivation. Thanks for sharing that with us. As well, I have one final question. It's actually about working in the real estate market for the future. Like, where do you see it, if the African real estate market?
I mean, it as I mentioned earlier, there's so many sectors, and you have to have an understanding of Africa to know what sector of real estate is required in what country. I can give you
Okay.
some quick examples. Rwanda has a lack of retail supermalls.
Mm.
So if you're going to get involved in a project in Rwanda, for example, I would personally tell you get involved in retail malls because there's opportunities there. If you're going
Okay.
to get involved in a residential project, I will tell you Ghana and Nigeria are actively seeking assistance in affordable housing. So that's for the
Okay.
low to lower middle class income earners. If you're
Okay.
going to get involved in industrial project, I would certainly tell you Kenya, because that's the area in which, as I mentioned, it's Silicon Valley. So they're
Hmm.
looking for hubs. If you're looking for a commercial base, Ethiopia is the home to the African Union. So in terms of commercialization or commercial offices, a lot of banks are trying to get into that sector, a lot of private equity firms. So you have to know the terrain. It's not one shoe fits all sizes. You have to know specifically what country requires what. Also, I've missed out on the luxury hotel sector, and there's fantastic opportunities in some places like Mozambique, for example, or in places like Gambia.
Hmm.
So there are opportunities across the board. You just have to know which country requires what, and you have to do your numbers. It's a numbers game. Don't think you're just going to turn up and build something and just get the returns. You have to know your feasibility studies prior to actually conducting or laying the first brick. So there's opportunities everywhere in Africa. Just make sure you know what you're doing.
So I'm gonna ask you a little of a trick question. I don't know if you'll answer it or not, but
Oh,
if you were to say an African country that is on the rise, that people actually don't consider it to be on the rise, or didn't even uh, think of it to be a country for real estate, which one would you name?
okay, I'm going to straight away take out a few countries. So people, when you think of Africa and real estate, you think of Nigeria, you think
Hmm.
of Kenya, you
Hmm.
think of South Africa, you think
Yeah.
of Ghana. Yes, those are good countries, but in order to answer your question about unsuspecting countries.
Yeah.
Rwanda has great potential. Reason being is because the government has put in some fantastic laws and legislations that assist the ease of doing business. There's a growing population there. When you think of Rwanda, you tend to think of unfortunate situations of
Yes.
yesteryear, but
Hmm.
the environment has changed. So Rwanda is certainly a place. I'll always tell people, look, Tanzania is a fantastic place simply because of the tourism. So Tanzania, you've got opportunities there as well. There is politically stable. I also
Hmm.
tell people Senegal. Senegal has
Yes.
made great reforms into its legislations. We have something called Plan Senegal, which basically details in specific terms their vision for the future. And there's a lot of opportunities in real estate. Another unsuspecting country would definitely be Cote d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast,
Mm.
because they have a new government in place. They've just come out of a war, and at the same time, they're making great strides to modernize the country's investment. So there are fantastic opportunities in the capital, which is Abidjan. So Ivory Coast, great opportunities. Rwanda, great opportunities. Tanzania, great opportunities. And as I mentioned, Senegal, great opportunities as well.
Well, thank you very much for that. I wanted to put you on the spot, but you know your stuff, that's for sure. And that's the reason why we are interviewing you today. And thank you very much for taking the time to talk about Let's Move Africa. Alexander, it was a pleasure having you, and I wish you all the success.
It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for your time.
Take care. Bye bye.